Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Charles Lipson, Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago. Charles, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a lot to talk about the life of Henry Kissinger, a full century.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, Henry Kissinger is the topic of discussion today. He passed away. The former Secretary of State was 100 years old. Can you talk to us about his legacy? Because as you intimated, it's complicated because he was influential but controversial. Talk to us about that.
Well, um, let's say first that his life is a kind of arc of everything that happened after the 1920s. He was born in 1923, that's 100 years ago, in Bavaria, a town called Fürth. He immigrated to escape the Nazis with his family in 1938, about 6 months before Kristallnacht, when the Nazis went on a rampage and started breaking the windows. That's the crystal. And Nacht is night. So they went at night and broke the windows of all the Jewish stores. Kissinger then came back in World War II as a soldier and played a role in the liberation of Europe. He went back then. He eventually went to Harvard, got a undergraduate degree, and then a PhD, rose to the heights of academic life, and then, of course, under Richard Nixon and then later Gerald Ford, became Secretary of State. He started under Nixon as National Security Advisor. And I would just say that he is among the most influential foreign policy figures of the 20th century in the United States. The only secretaries of state who rank with him are George C. Marshall and Dean Acheson, who in the late 1940s erected the architecture of NATO and all the containment of the Soviet Union.
A few hours after his death was announced, you wrote an op-ed, and I want to quote you, and then if you could explain it further. This is what you wrote. Amid the debates about his life and career, he will surely be remembered as one of the most significant statesmen of the Cold War era. Can you talk to us about that?
Right. Well, as I say, the basic architecture, which was to contain the Soviet Union, was put in place in the late 1940s. What Kissinger did, and it's important always to think of Kissinger and Nixon in combination. Nixon was a great foreign policy thinker, a very shrewd, deep thinker about foreign policy. And he and Kissinger worked hand in glove um, to shift the position of China. China had, of course, fought the United States during the Korean War in the early 50s, and under Mao was the leading figure alongside the Soviet Union in promoting communist ideology worldwide, and the Soviet Union and China were allies. But what Kissinger and Nixon realized was that there was really a deepening cleavage between the Soviet Union and China, and that the United States could exploit that. And they did. They didn't turn China into an American ally, but they basically broke it away from being a Soviet ally and more into an adversary. And the impact of that, the initial impact, was to require the Soviet Union to put more forces on its border with China, and it has a long one, uh, and away from Europe. So that made NATO more secure. The longer run impact, which is much more mixed, is twofold. One, we basically gave to China, the PRC, Beijing, and the communists, the seat in the UN Security Council that had always been reserved for China, but that gave them a veto in the UN Security Council. But more consequential, I think, is that it laid the basis for Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, to reorient the Chinese economy away from the strict Soviet command and control model to one that allowed more competition, trade, and investment. And that allowed China to grow to become the great threat that it is now, both a security threat to the Western world and a threat to many American industries and workers that have to compete with China. So it's a very mixed, even on China, it's a very mixed verdict. And there are many other issues as well because he was involved in so many important issues.
I want to talk about the relationship with China first because it seems like, from what you're describing, short term, it was a good thing. Long term, present day, maybe not so much. Is that what you kind of gather from Henry Kissinger's China legacy?
Well, Kissinger himself, of course, was a revered figure in China and the primary mediator between Beijing and Washington for many, many years. And of course, he made his living off of that, basically. Uh, but I don't think money was motivated him. I think the fact that he was basically in a world where he communicated with the leading political figures in the world and gave them his advice was what was deeply pleasing to him. He was, of course, a major scholar too, and he wrote a lot of books, including books on China. But I think his goal was to ensure that the U.S.-China relationship didn't deepen into what I think has all really happened, which is that we are now in a Cold War with China.
I do now want to talk about how controversial he is. I don't know if you were on Twitter last night. I mean, it lit up. People were really celebrating his death. The Rolling Stone, their headline to his obit was essentially a war criminal has died. He's been called a war criminal. He's been blamed for anywhere from thousands to millions of deaths worldwide. Talk us about this type of, legacy that he left when it comes to being controversial.
Other than that, Rolling Stone thought well of him.
No, they did not think well of him. I actually have the headline. They wrote this: Henry Kissinger, war criminal beloved by America's ruling class, finally dies.
Uh, well, if you can't take your foreign policy advice from Rolling Stone, who can you really get it from? Um, Kissinger was involved in two um, very controversial issues. Uh, one was, besides his association with Nixon, which, of course, led him to be reviled by so many, but he was involved in the supporting, not instigating, but supporting the coup in Chile and uh, sus- in Nixon's policy of gradually sh- shifting the fighting in Vietnam, the American role in the war, to more and more South Vietnamese taking on the fighting role. But the Nixon administration continued the war for the entire Nixon administration, sort of 5 or 6 years, and um, about half of the Americans who died in Vietnam died during that period. So anybody who Kissinger won the Peace Prize for along with the lead Vietnamese negotiator for the treaty that ended the war. But the treaty itself, in my opinion, was a kind of fig leaf. It was designed to get the Americans out of the war without the war ending in defeat immediately. But Kissinger surely knew that it was going to end in defeat for the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese communists taking over a year or two after the Americans left, and that is exactly what happened. Now, in Chile, you had a minority government, but democratically elected under Salvador Allende, and it was inching closer and closer to an alliance with the Soviet Union. Uh, in 1973, there was a coup led by the general Augusto Pinochet. There was a very brutal coup. It led to the death of Allende, and the American left was already infuriated with Kissinger as being a warmonger in Vietnam. And so then they also thought he was anti democratic in what had happened in Chile. They exaggerated the American role there, but American support for the Chilean right wing was absolutely crucial i- uh, in solidifying that coup. The way I interpret this, Brittany, is that Kissinger is what in the foreign policy realm was called a realist. That is, he just looked at what are American interests, including our alliances, who we want to support our allies. We want to make sure that our enemies, like the Soviet Union, don't gain an ally in South America to go with Cuba and so forth and make the American position there vulnerable. But Kissinger realized, as did Nixon, that in the American context, you couldn't be a pure realist. And the reason you couldn't is that American voters think that part of our interests are in our ideals, in our goals. So when you have a situation like what happened in Chile, you have the interest of keeping the Soviet Union out as an ally, contradicting the fact that we normally support democratic institutions and democratic leaders, and we don't overthrow them. So you have the two clashing. And in that context, people like Kissinger and Nixon are caught betwixt and between. But Henry Kissinger made no apologies for any of that.
I do also want to mention that he directed essentially a carpet bombing campaign in Cambodia that resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, and then the Cambodian, that which people say led to the Cambodian genocide that killed millions. But last night, Antony Blinken, our current Secretary of State, commented on Henry Kissinger, and he said this: he really set the standard for everyone who'd followed in this job. What do you think that standard is?
I think it's just vacuous words in that regard. I think what Kissinger did that very few leaders that have come after him have done, and I think this is really true also of Nixon, is that they were strategic thinkers, not just tactical ones. Okay. And if you look at most leaders of the State Department or the National Security Council, they don't really think in terms of larger strategic goals and how we should formulate those. That is, in a way, understandable. The number of memoranda and phone calls and pressing issues that come across their desk every day make it very difficult to do that. That's why the fact that Kissinger had spent an adult lifetime thinking about those issues, including nuclear weapons. We can talk about that in a moment if you're interested. But he thought about that before he entered office because you just don't have time once you're in office. You need to draw on your capital reserves, intellectual capital reserves, to think all that through. The major nuclear issue came during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The Soviet Union had instigated that war secretly. They told the Egyptians that the Syrians were going to invade Israel, and they told the Syrians that the Egyptians were going to invade, and both should get on board, and the Soviets would support them. So it was a surprise attack on Israel, put Israel on its back foot. Israel did regain its footing and started to defeat them. At that point, and Kissinger and Nixon started an airlift to Israel of both military and civilian supplies. But at this point, the United States intelligence services saw that a ship was going toward Egypt, and they thought that ship contained nuclear weapons. And it was designed to be nuclear intimidation by the Soviet Union on behalf of its allies against Israel. At that point, the Nixon administration, certainly with Kissinger in a central position there, escalated our nuclear readiness. Those are called DEFCON, DEFCON, DEFCON alerts. The highest level is level 1, the lowest level is 5. He moved it up to 3. And that was a signal, along with the airlifts. It was a signal that to the Soviet Union, not so much to Egypt and Syria, but it's a signal to the Soviet Union that the United States did not intend to allow Israel to be intimidated by the Moscow's nuclear arsenal.
Charles, what was interesting to me last night, this morning, today, when I was sifting through social media, when I was looking at the news, he was involved in many conflicts worldwide. He had a long spanning career, a long life. And what was really interesting was the disconnect between what people were saying. Some elite people, some politicians, all revering him on social media. And it seemed like the general population really was calling him a war criminal, celebrating his death. Why do we see this disconnect here between politicians and how they remember Henry Kissinger and then the general population, overall?
That's an interesting question, Brittany. Let me give you a speculation, which is something less than a solid answer. First of all, my advice to everyone is to not get your news from TikTok or Twitter, um, to go to more serious places, like listening to Brittany.
Thank you.
Uh, and the second thing is that those venues are dominated by young people, and we know what's happened in the below 30 demographic is how far left they've moved. And hating Kissinger is just a talisman of the left. But I'm not here to apologize for Kissinger or to oppose him. I'm trying at this point to begin a kind of analysis of the long arc of his role in public life. By the way, when I first went to Harvard for my PhD, I was an undergraduate at Yale in the late 60s. I went to Harvard for my PhD. He had just left Harvard, and in fact, the courses I taught in, he would have been the lecturer had I been there a year or two earlier. So all the people I work with, of course, knew him very well. I did not. But he was a towering figure in the academic world. When he was an undergraduate, Brittany, he wrote his BA thesis. It was 800 pages.
Wow.
And Harvard had to set new rules for its BA theses after he had finished his. He then rose very quickly through the ranks after his PhD of the professorships, and was tightly linked at an early point with Nelson Rockefeller, who was a major player in the Republican Party. Rockefeller did an analysis of U.S. foreign policy. Henry Kissinger was the main person who oversaw that. That brought him not only to Rockefeller's attention, but to Nixon's, and that's how he got that appointment. But it severed his relationship with the academy. Uh, People who had supported the Vietnam War were simply not welcomed back on campus. If they had tenure, universities figured out a way to deny it to them. Walt Rostow, who had been involved in the Vietnam War and was a tenured professor at MIT, basically wasn't allowed back on campus. So what you see on campus now is much, much, much worse, but many of those themes really began in the 1960s, and some of the professors, people who got PhDs during that era have had a long march through the universities with a huge impact on the way that younger people see the world. And that's what you saw on Twitter and so forth. But I think that um, this is all embedded in a larger context, I think, of seeing the United States, basically as a malevolent force in the world. I think it's an underlying theme of Barack Obama as he sees us in the world, and I think it's the main difference between him and Joe Biden in terms of their foreign policy. Biden is constrained by the changes in the Democratic Party and the sort of anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian movement, especially among younger people and progressives. But Biden is much more a traditional Cold Warrior. He could have worked. He wouldn't have ever appointed Kissinger, but he could have worked with him. He would have sat down and listened to his thoughts. But that's not something that Barack Obama could have ever done. And I think that represents one of the major cleavages in America now. The other one is on the Republican side, where you see the rise of isolationism once again, a traditional theme in the Republican Party that was kind of wiped out in the early 50s when Dwight Eisenhower won the nomination over Mr. Republican, an isolationist named Robert Taft from Ohio. But you now see this theme recurring in the Republican Party. Henry Kissinger, to go back to him, Henry Kissinger was the opposite of all of that. He represented that sense of America having a large role in the world, but he was different from the traditional American sense that our role is really to carry our ideals. For Henry Kissinger, our role was to advance our interests.
Do you think that is a good outlook, a productive outlook? What do you make of that?
I think that we do need to think A, about our interests, B, about the limits of what we can do. We don't have infinite resources. We can't do everything everywhere. But C, I think that part of what all Americans want, or most Americans want in our foreign policy, is one that conforms to, adheres to, and advances what we think is really important in the world, and that's stable constitutional democracies. The problem is that in some countries that's not on offer. It wasn't on offer in Iraq. It's not going to be on offer in Gaza. It's not going to be on offer in the West Bank. It's not in Lebanon, not in Syria. So in those areas, you have to think really hard about what our interests are and what the limits of what we're willing to spend to pursue those interests.
Charles, before I let you go, another piece from your op-ed caught my eye, and I just want you to give us a little synopsis here. So you said this, Henry Kissinger led a consequential life. The consequences are with us still. Can you just, what are those consequences?
Well, well, first of all, Brittany, it is great to speak with you. I think that the main consequences would be the relationship with China and China's rise in the world. I think that the other is that in a certain way he made the world safe for thinking about American interests in a kind of hard-headed way. Um, and you can see the pushback about that because in a lot of ways, the people who are saying what you did in Chile was a war crime. Um, I think that the issue of Vietnam is a much more mixed one because I don't see how. I think what Kissinger and Nixon were handed was a war that was already in process. And the question they had was how to wind it down. What you saw with Joe Biden in Afghanistan was how to do it the wrong way. His military wanted him to leave too 4,500 people there as a kind of anchor to buttress the government. Biden, in his wisdom, I use the word lightly, said withdraw them. And chaos ensued immediately. Nixon and Kissinger were faced with something like 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam fighting against the North with no obvious way, and going through infiltrating down from the North through Cambodia, through taking over Laos and so forth, the neighboring countries, and no easy way to get out of the war or to win it. But I think they can be held accountable in a negative way for continuing the war as long as they did, because in the end, when they got out, they didn't leave us in any better position than getting out 2 or 3 years earlier. The reason they didn't get out earlier, I think, is that they thought it would undermine America's position in the world. But America's position in the world was undermined in many ways, uh, even after they got out. And of course, Nixon's the corruption that Americans saw in the Nixon administration is what gave us Jimmy Carter and all the disasters that ensued from that.
Charles, we have to leave it there, but per usual, I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your insights. Charles Lipson, thank you for joining me.